Hey everyone, today we dive into one of the most baffling geological mysteries ever discovered on American soil, the incredible story of Devil's Kettle Falls, where half a river literally vanishes into the earth and nobody knew where it went for over a century. What really happened when scientists finally decided to solve this puzzle will change everything you think you know about the hidden world beneath our feet. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now settle in, dim the lights if you want, and let me take you through this remarkable journey that begins in the wilderness of northern Minnesota, just miles from the Canadian border. Picture this. It's a crisp October morning in 1996, and Jeff Green is driving north on Highway 61 with his family, the autumn colors of Minnesota's North Shore blazing around them in brilliant reds and golds. They're heading to Judge C.R. Magny State Park for what Green thinks will be just another family hiking adventure. Green works as a hydrologist for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, spending his days studying groundwater systems and solving water mysteries across the state. He's seen countless rivers, streams, and waterfalls in his career. Nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. The family parks at the small lot near the park entrance, where a weathered wooden sign warns visitors about the strenuous hike ahead. Green shoulders his day pack, helps his kids lace up their hiking boots, and starts up the trail that winds through some of the most pristine wilderness left in the continental United States. The path climbs steadily through dense forests of birch and maple, in the fallen leaves crunching underfoot, the scent of pine and damp earth filling their lungs. Lake Superior stretches endlessly beyond the tree line, its waters so clear you can see the rocky bottom 20 feet down. They climb for over a mile, ascending nearly 200 wooden stairs carved into the hillside, their legs burning, their breath visible in the cool northern air. The sound of rushing water grows louder with each step, echoing off the ancient rock walls that have witnessed over 1 billion years of Earth's history. Green's children race ahead, excited by the promise of waterfalls, while he follows at a more measured pace, his trained eye already noting the geological features around them. The rock here is old, incredibly old, formed during the mid-continent rift when the very heart of North America was literally tearing itself apart. And then they see it. The Brule River, crystal clear and powerful, racing toward what should be a simple waterfall. But as they round that final bend in the trail, Green stops dead in his tracks. His children are already at the viewing platform, pointing and shouting with excitement. But Green can only stare in professional bewilderment at what he's witnessing. The river doesn't just fall, it splits. Right there, at a massive outcropping of volcanic rock harder than granite. The Brule River divides into two completely separate streams, each carrying thousands of gallons of water every minute. The eastern stream behaves exactly as Green would expect from his years of studying water systems, tumbling 50 feet down a two-step waterfall in spectacular fashion, crashing into the pool below with thunderous force before continuing its ancient journey toward Lake Superior. But the western stream does something that challenges everything Green understands about hydrology. It rolls over the edge and plunges into a gaping hole in the solid rock, a cavernous opening that locals have dubbed the Devil's Kettle. And then, as if the earth itself has swallowed it whole, the water simply disappears. Green watches for 20 minutes, then an hour, waiting for some sign of where that massive volume of water is going. Nothing. No bubbling downstream, no obvious resurgence point, no indication that the western stream even exists once it enters that black void. He walks the entire length of the river below the falls, scanning for any trace of the missing water. His hydrologist's mind races through possibilities, but none of them make sense given the geological context. This is rhyolite and basalt, some of the hardest rock on the planet. There shouldn't be cave systems here. No underground rivers, no geological mechanism that could swallow half a river without a trace. Standing at the edge of this phenomenon, Green experiences something that will haunt him for the next 20 years. The humbling realization that nature still holds secrets his science cannot explain. He spent his entire career believing that water systems, no matter how complex, eventually reveal their logic to careful observation and measurement. But Devil's Kettle seems to operate outside the laws of physics, defying every principle of hydrology he's ever learned. As the Green family finally heads back down the trail, Jeff can't stop looking over his shoulder at the waterfall. His children chatter excitedly about what they've seen, already spinning stories about where the water might go. But Green walks in thoughtful silence. He's witnessed thousands of geological formations in his career, but nothing like this. Nothing that so completely challenges his understanding of how water moves through the landscape. But here's where our story really begins, because Green's experience that October day was far from unique. For over a century, Devil's Kettle has been capturing the imagination and confounding the intellect of everyone who encounters it. The mystery stretches back to the earliest days of European exploration in the region, when French fur traders first heard Native American stories about a waterfall where the spirits drank half the river. These early accounts, passed down through generations of Ojibwe oral tradition, spoke of the falls as a sacred place where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected, where water disappeared into the realm of the spirits never to return. The first written account of Devil's Kettle appeared in the journal of a surveyor named Joseph Nicolet in 1837, who described it as a most peculiar phenomenon of nature, wherein a considerable portion of the river seems to be swallowed by the earth itself, leaving no trace of its passage. Nicolet spent 3 days at the falls, dropping various objects into the hole and waiting for them to resurface downstream. Nothing ever did. He left the area convinced he had witnessed something that science could not explain. As word of the mysterious waterfall spread, Devil's Kettle became a pilgrimage site for geologists, naturalists, and curious travelers. In the 1880s, when the logging industry was transforming northern Minnesota, loggers working the Brule River would often detour to the falls during their lunch breaks. They developed their own theories about where the water went, with some claiming it traveled all the way to the Mississippi River system, others insisting it emerged in Hudson Bay. The loggers began the tradition of throwing objects into the Devil's Kettle, starting with simple things like lunch pails and tobacco tins, escalating over the years to more elaborate experiments. By the early 1900s, the Minnesota Geological Survey had sent multiple expeditions to study the falls. Their reports, filed in dusty archives in St. Paul, reveal a growing frustration with the phenomenon. Geologist Newton Winchell wrote in 1903, "The Devil's Kettle presents a conundrum that challenges our fundamental understanding of surface hydrology. The volume of water entering the aperture is substantial, yet no corresponding emergence has been detected despite extensive downstream observation." The mystery deepened in 1923, when a young geology professor named Charles Schwartz from the University of Minnesota organized what was perhaps the most ambitious early attempt to solve the Devil's Kettle puzzle. And Schwartz and his team spent an entire summer at the falls, conducting experiments that had never been attempted before. They poured hundreds of gallons of colored dye into the hole, expecting to trace the water's path through the underground system. The dye vanished without a trace. They constructed a flotation device equipped with a crude signaling mechanism, hoping it would somehow surface and reveal the water's destination. It disappeared like everything else. Most dramatically, Schwartz convinced a local blacksmith to forge a series of metal balls with his initials engraved on them. The idea was that these heavy, durable objects would survive whatever underground journey awaited them and eventually resurface somewhere recognizable. Over the course of several weeks, they dropped dozens of these marked spheres into the Devil's Kettle, then organized search parties to scour the shores of Lake Superior and the entire downstream length of the Brule River. Not a single ball was ever found. Schwartz's final report, submitted to the university in the fall of 1923, included with a statement that would echo through decades of subsequent research. The Devil's Kettle appears to violate the fundamental principle of water conservation. The quantity of water entering the aperture exceeds any reasonable estimate of what could be accommodated by fractures or cavities in the surrounding bedrock. We are forced to conclude that we are observing a phenomenon that current geological science cannot adequately explain. This conclusion launched what locals began calling the Devil's Kettle Challenge, an informal competition among scientists, amateur researchers, and curious visitors to see who could solve the mystery. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the falls became a testing ground for increasingly creative experiments. A professor from Michigan Tech tried using radio transmitters sealed in waterproof containers, hoping to track their underground journey. The signals simply stopped the moment the devices entered the water. A group of engineering students from the University of Wisconsin attempted to lower a camera into the hole, but the tremendous hydraulic forces made it impossible to get meaningful footage. The post-war years brought new technology and renewed scientific interest to Devil's Kettle. In 1952, a team from the U.S. Geological Survey conducted the most comprehensive study of the falls to date, using precision instruments to map the underground geology and measure water flow patterns. Their investigation revealed something that made the mystery even more perplexing. The bedrock beneath Devil's Kettle was virtually solid, with no evidence of the kind of large-scale cave systems that would be necessary to accommodate a disappearing river. Dr. Harrison Matthews, who led the 1952 expedition, published his findings in the Journal of Hydrology, with obvious frustration evident in his writing. Our subsurface investigations reveal a geological context wholly unsuitable for the phenomenon we observe at Devil's Kettle, he wrote. The rhyolite formation shows minimal fracturing, and the underlying basalt exhibits the typical characteristics of flood basalt, which forms in horizontal sheets rather than the columnar structures that might create vertical passages. By all geological principles, the Devil's Kettle should not exist. But exist it did, and as the decades passed, the mystery only grew more famous. The 1960s brought the era of modern outdoor recreation to Minnesota's North Shore, and Devil's Kettle became one of the state's premier natural attractions. Thousands of visitors made the pilgrimage up those wooden stairs each year, and many of them continued the tradition of throwing objects into the mysterious hole. Park rangers began keeping informal logs of what people dropped into the Devil's Kettle, creating a bizarre inventory that included everything from wedding rings to baseball caps, from full bottles of soda to fishing tackle boxes. Local legends grew more elaborate with each passing year. Some claimed that on quiet nights, you could hear voices echoing from deep within the earth, as if the Devil's Kettle were a gateway to underground caverns populated by lost explorers. Others insisted that the hole was actually a portal to other dimensions, citing the fact that nothing ever returned as evidence that objects were being transported to entirely different realities. The more scientifically minded proposed theories about massive underground rivers flowing beneath northern Minnesota, connecting Devil's Kettle to distant watersheds, or emerging in the depths of Lake Superior as submarine springs. By the 1970s, the phenomenon had attracted international attention. A team of Japanese hydrologists, experts in volcanic cave systems, visited the falls in 1974, hoping their experience with lava tubes would provide insights. They left empty-handed and thoroughly puzzled. British cavers, drawn by stories of the ultimate underground challenge, attempted to rappel into the Devil's Kettle in 1978. The expedition had to be abandoned when they discovered that the hydraulic forces in the hole were too violent to allow safe descent beyond about 26 feet, and even at that depth, the bottom remained invisible in the churning darkness. The 1980s brought the most famous attempt to solve the Devil's Kettle mystery, when a wealthy businessman named Richard Carlson became obsessed with the phenomenon after visiting the falls during a corporate retreat. Carlson funded an elaborate expedition that included professional cave divers, underwater cameras, and custom-built tracking devices designed to withstand extreme conditions. The project, which local media dubbed Operation Kettle, consumed 3 summers and cost over $200,000. The diving attempts proved impossible due to the violent water conditions in the hole. The custom tracking devices, equipped with sonar beacons and designed to survive impacts that would destroy conventional equipment, vanished just like everything else. Most frustratingly, Carlson's team dropped nearly 1,000 numbered ping-pong balls into the Devil's Kettle over the course of 3 years, then organized volunteer search parties to patrol the entire north shore of Lake Superior. Despite hundreds of people spending thousands of hours searching beaches, river mouths, and coastal areas, not a single numbered ball was ever found. Carlson's final expedition report, published in a geology journal in 1987, included a statement that captured the growing sense of defeat among Devil's Kettle researchers. "We have exhausted every reasonable method of tracing the water's path through this system. Our conclusion is that the Devil's Kettle operates according to principles that are not yet understood by modern science. Until new technologies or theoretical frameworks emerge, this phenomenon must remain classified as unexplained." It was around this time that Jeff Green, still early in his career as a hydrologist, first encountered the scientific literature about Devil's Kettle. Reading through decades of failed experiments and frustrated conclusions, Green found himself both intrigued and skeptical. His training had taught him that water always follows predictable patterns, always obeys the laws of physics, always leaves traces that careful observation can detect. The idea that a natural phenomenon could be genuinely inexplicable struck him as unlikely, but the sheer volume of credible research documenting the mystery was undeniable. Green filed Devil's Kettle away in the back of his mind as one of those fascinating puzzles he might investigate someday when he had time and resources. But it wasn't until that family vacation in 1996, when he stood at the edge of the falls and witnessed the phenomenon firsthand, that his casual interest transformed into genuine obsession. Seeing the massive volume of water disappearing into that black hole, experiencing the complete absence of any visible resurgence downstream, Green realized that all the scientific reports he'd read had actually understated how baffling Devil's Kettle really was. The years following Green's first visit to the falls were busy ones for the hydrologist. His work with the Minnesota DNR involved constant travel around the state, studying groundwater contamination, mapping aquifer systems, and conducting dye trace studies to understand how water moved through various geological formations. But no matter how demanding his professional responsibilities became, Green found his thoughts returning again and again to Devil's Kettle. He began carrying a file folder of research papers about the falls, reading through the accumulated decades of failed investigations during lunch breaks and quiet moments in the office. What struck Green most about the existing research was how it had focused almost exclusively on trying to trace where the missing water went, rather than first establishing whether it was actually missing at all. Every expedition had started with the assumption that the water disappearing into Devil's Kettle was being transported to some distant location, then attempted to find evidence of that transportation. But as Green's experience with groundwater systems had taught him, the most important question in any hydrological investigation was often the simplest one: how much water is actually involved? In 1998, Green attended a conference in Duluth where he met Calvin Alexander, a University of Minnesota professor who specialized in karst hydrology and groundwater tracing. Alexander was nearing retirement after a distinguished career studying underground water systems, particularly the complex cave networks found in southeastern Minnesota's limestone regions. During a conversation over coffee, Green mentioned his fascination with Devil's Kettle, expecting Alexander to dismiss it as one of those unsolvable mysteries that every region seemed to have. Instead, Alexander's eyes lit up with genuine interest. He'd heard of Devil's Kettle, of course, but had never seriously considered investigating it because it fell outside his area of expertise. Limestone cave systems were his specialty, and Devil's Kettle was clearly not a limestone phenomenon. But as Green described the various failed attempts to trace the missing water, Alexander found himself thinking about the problem from a different angle. "You know," Alexander said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "in all my years studying underground water systems, I've learned that the first rule of hydrology is that water is conservative. It doesn't just disappear. If you can't find where it's going, maybe the question isn't where it's going, but whether it's actually going anywhere at all." This conversation planted a seed that would grow over the next several years. Green and Alexander began corresponding regularly, sharing ideas about Devil's Kettle and discussing the various theories that had been proposed over the decades. Both men were struck by the fact that despite all the attention the phenomenon had received, no one had ever conducted the most basic hydrological measurement, comparing the flow above and below the falls to determine if water was actually being lost from the river system. By 2014, Alexander was fully retired and looking for interesting projects to occupy his time. Green, now a senior hydrologist with the DNR, had the expertise and equipment necessary to conduct precise flow measurements. The two men began seriously planning an expedition to Devil's Kettle, not to trace where the missing water went, but to determine if it was actually missing in the first place. Their planning took over a year, as they worked out the logistics of transporting sensitive measuring equipment to the remote waterfall and coordinated with state park officials to ensure their research wouldn't interfere with visitor activities. They decided to conduct their measurements in late fall 2016, when tourist traffic would be minimal and water levels would be at moderate, consistent flows that would give them the most accurate readings. The morning of their expedition dawned cold and clear, with the first hints of winter already visible in the bare branches of the deciduous trees. Green and Alexander met at the park entrance just after sunrise, their vehicles loaded with precision stream gauging equipment that could measure water flow to within a fraction of a cubic foot per second. They also carried backup instruments, data loggers, and all the scientific documentation necessary to ensure their measurements would be credible and reproducible. The hike up to Devil's Kettle that morning was different from any of the thousands of recreational visits that had preceded it. While Green and Alexander moved slowly, stopping frequently to examine the river, note geological features, and discuss their measurement strategy. They were acutely aware that they were about to conduct an experiment that could finally solve one of America's most famous geological mysteries, or potentially add their names to the long list of researchers who had been defeated by the Devil's Kettle enigma. When they reached the falls, both men spent several minutes simply observing the phenomenon that had puzzled so many before them. The sight was every bit as mystifying as the literature had described. The eastern waterfall thundered down its rocky cascade in perfect conformity with hydrological principles, while the western stream vanished into that gaping hole, as if the laws of physics simply stopped applying at the edge of the Devil's Kettle. Alexander, despite his decades of experience with underground water systems, found himself momentarily speechless at the apparent impossibility of what he was witnessing. But they hadn't come to marvel at the mystery. They'd come to solve it. Green unpacked the first set of measuring equipment and began setting up a flow gauging station upstream from the falls, where the Brule River was still flowing as a single, undivided stream. The instruments were sophisticated pieces of technology, capable of measuring not just the speed of the water flow, but also its depth and cross-sectional area, allowing for precise calculations of total volume moving through the river per second. As Green worked with the equipment, Alexander explored the area below the falls, looking for any obvious signs of water resurgence that previous researchers might have missed. He paid particular attention to the main pool where the eastern waterfall terminated, watching for unusual boiling or bubbling that might indicate underground water returning to the surface. He also examined the riverbank for several hundred yards downstream, noting every seep, spring, and anomaly in the water flow. The first measurement came back at 123 cubic feet per second. Green double-checked the calculation, verified the instrument calibrations, and ran the measurement sequence again. The number remained consistent. The Brule River, flowing as a single stream above Devil's Kettle, was carrying 123 cubic feet of water per second past their gauging station. Now came the moment of truth. Green and Alexander packed up their equipment and moved downstream, past the mysterious waterfall, past the point where half the river supposedly vanished forever into the depths of the earth. They set up their gauges again, several hundred feet below Devil's Kettle, in a section of the river where only the water from the eastern fall was supposed to be flowing. The tension was palpable as they waited for the instruments to complete their measurements. After decades of speculation, theories, and failed experiments, they were about to get a definitive answer about whether water was actually leaving the river system. Green watched the digital readout with the intensity of a man whose entire understanding of hydrology hung in the balance. The reading came back at 121 cubic feet per second. The Green stared at the numbers, hardly believing what he was seeing. Alexander leaned over to confirm the measurement, then looked up at Green with an expression of amazement mixed with professional satisfaction. In the world of stream gauging, those two measurements weren't just close, they were identical. The tiny difference of 2 cubic feet per second was well within the margin of error for the equipment. What this meant was revolutionary, overturning over a century of assumptions about Devil's Kettle. No water was leaving the river. None. Zero. The Brule River was flowing at essentially the same volume below Devil's Kettle as it was above it. The water falling into that mysterious hole wasn't traveling to Lake Superior through hidden underground channels. It wasn't flowing to Canada or connecting to distant watersheds. It wasn't disappearing into the center of the earth. The water was simply rejoining the main river immediately downstream, hidden from view but never actually leaving the Brule River system. The implications hit both men like physical blows. Everything that generations of visitors, researchers, and theorists had believed about Devil's Kettle was wrong. The phenomenon that had stumped geologists for over a century, that had consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars in research funding, that had spawned countless theories about underground rivers and dimensional portals, was actually a straightforward example of water following the path of least resistance through fractures in the bedrock. But this discovery raised an entirely new question that was almost as baffling as the original mystery. If the water was rejoining the river right below the falls, why couldn't anyone see where it came back up? And what had happened to all those objects that people had thrown into the Devil's Kettle over the years? Green and Alexander had solved one mystery only to uncover another. The answer, when they worked it out, revealed the true power and violence of what was happening beneath Devil's Kettle. Alexander, drawing on his decades of experience studying water dynamics, explained that the plunge pool below the mysterious hole was actually one of the most destructive hydraulic environments imaginable. The water falling into Devil's Kettle created what he called an unbelievably powerful system of recirculating currents, a kind of natural blender that operated with the force of thousands of tons of falling water concentrated into a relatively small space. When objects fell into this maelstrom, they weren't gently carried along underground passages to emerge intact at distant locations, because they were pulverized. Ping-pong balls were crushed flat instantly by the hydraulic pressure, Logs were splintered into fragments too small to recognize. Even GPS devices, built to withstand impacts and submersion, were simply torn apart by the incredible forces. The recirculating currents in the plunge pool acted like a washing machine on steroids, holding debris underwater and grinding it against the rock walls until it was destroyed or broken down into particles so small they were unrecognizable when they finally emerged downstream. This explained why none of the objects thrown into Devil's Kettle over the decades had ever been found intact. It wasn't because they were traveling to mysterious underground destinations. It was because they were being obliterated by the sheer violence of the water system before they could resurface. The Devil's Kettle wasn't a portal to hidden worlds. It was nature's ultimate demolition machine, capable of destroying virtually anything that entered it. Looking more carefully at the area below Devil's Kettle, Green and Alexander noticed something that previous observers had overlooked. Two distinct boils of water rising from the riverbed, areas where underground flow was clearly emerging back into the mainstream. The water falling into Devil's Kettle was traveling a very short distance underground, probably no more than a few dozen feet, before resurging through fractures in the rock and rejoining the Brule River. The resolution of the Devil's Kettle mystery sent shockwaves through the geological community when the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources announced the findings in February 2017. Some researchers were amazed that such a famous puzzle had yielded to such a straightforward investigation. Others were embarrassed that no one had thought to conduct basic flow measurements during the previous century of study. Environmental groups praised the work as an example of how simple scientific methods could answer complex questions without invasive or potentially harmful research techniques. Green himself admitted there was something bittersweet about solving such a famous mystery. For 20 years, Devil's Kettle had represented the ultimate challenge to his understanding of hydrology, a phenomenon that seemed to operate outside the laws of physics. Now that he knew the truth, the waterfall was still beautiful, still impressive, but it had lost some of its magical quality. The unknown had become known. The impossible had become mundane. Yet somehow, knowing the truth doesn't diminish the power of experiencing Devil's Kettle firsthand. Visitors still make that challenging hike up 200 wooden stairs through the pristine Minnesota wilderness. They still stand at the edge of that ancient rhyolite outcropping and watch in amazement as half the Brule River plunges into the earth and seems to vanish. The difference is that now we understand what we're seeing. The water isn't disappearing into mysterious underground realms. It's not traveling to Canada or connecting to distant watersheds. It's simply taking a brief underground detour before rejoining its ancient path to Lake Superior. The story of Devil's Kettle teaches us something profound about the nature of mystery itself and our relationship with the unknown. For over a century, people were so invested in the falls being genuinely supernatural that they never tried the most obvious scientific test. The allure of the impossible, the excitement of witnessing something that seemed to violate natural law, was so powerful that it actually prevented people from seeking rational explanations. Sometimes the most profound mysteries hide the simplest answers, and sometimes the most straightforward solution is the one we're least likely to consider. What they discovered changed everything we thought we knew about one of America's most famous geological puzzles. But it also revealed something even more important, that the natural world is still full of wonders waiting to be understood. Mysteries that yield their secrets not to those who accept the impossible, but to those who refuse to stop asking questions.